video, I missed out on the discussion section, on the post-video activity. So for the last video, we had ecosystem and adaptations activity. So you need to go to the discussion labeled ecosystems and adaptations and follow the instructions there. Now if we're moving on to chapter 3.4, which is 4.4, sorry, which is our ecosystem diversity. So now we're looking at, because of the different components, sort of building on what I finished with last video, as we talked about. Most ecosystems have their own particular community of producers, consumers, and decomposers. Now, by comparing different regions with similar conditions, we've been able to actually make some observations that similar producers have evolved. In Australia, the majority of habitats are quite dry, with very nutrient-poor soils, and a very high light intensity. This means that there are adaptations that have developed that are reasonably consistent to cope with these conditions. For example, the rigid waxy leaves of these sclerophyll plants mentioned earlier. They're a wonderful example of this, and they're found in many native plants. So if we consider the classic example of our eucalypt trees, gum trees, they are a classic example of the sclerophyll adaptations, these waxy, rigid leaves. We can also think of acacias, of wattles. They're also another example, and we can keep going through all of these native plants and see these adaptations and how they've played out to deal with these abiotic conditions. So the reason for this is so that they can survive the elements. In order for a species to survive in its habitat, the following factors need to be considered. What interactions are there in the community? So are they intraspecific, so between individuals of the same species? Or are they interspecific, so between different species? Is there this competition? So an example of intraspecific competition would be competition for mates, where come breeding season, male kangaroos box each other in order to secure a mate, and whoever presumably wins the battle is the one who gets to mate with the most females. An interspecific example of competition, the easiest example is competition for food between two different populations that share the same food source. So owls and foxes hunting mice. They're both after the same food source, so there exists some interspecific competition there. We also need to consider how many resources are available, both the biotic and abiotic resources. What the weather and climate is like, which is again an abiotic factor, and then lastly what human activities are having an impact there. Interestingly, before we go on, certain animals actually thrive when human activities take place. You can think of the domesticated animals that are obvious, our dogs and cats, our pets, but also some of the other sort of less desirable ones, like mice and rats. They thrive where human activity lives because we're trashy people. We make a lot of waste, and these are animals that are able to take advantage of that. So human activities isn't always associated with loss of population, but it always is associated, or almost always is associated, with a loss of diversity. And as we've been laboring in these videos, it's that loss of diversity that reduces or weakens our ecosystems. So the more environmental factors more discussion of environmental factors and evolution now. So sunlight. Sunlight has driven evolution in most ecosystems, particularly in Australia. Now we can see this especially in a highly competitive rainforest ecosystem. And this is where we have an amazing diversity of life in these rainforests. And they will come to be dominated by a few specific producers. And so we talk about this. So our low-lying plants, they've got very large leaves, and this is to capture as much light as they can from the very little light that filters down. In a really thick rainforest, you might have a light penetration of 10% or 5%. So that means that 90 or 95% of the light that would actually normally land on that ground is being filtered by the plants above. So at that ground level, it's very dark, very little light comes through. So these very large leaves are adaptations to allow these plants to capture as much of that as possible. Australia is an extraordinarily dry continent. It's dominated by desert, by grassland, by shrubland, by ecosystems that are able to survive a lack of water. Where you look at where we have lots of rain, so Queensland is a really good example of that, there's a lot of tropical rainforests in northern Queensland. The closer we get to the tropics, the more water we have as that abiotic resource, the larger the plants can be. Smaller plants can live with drier conditions. This is most clearly illustrated, this relationship between water, or the lack of water, and the and producers that are present as we go from the center to the coast. And I'll put up in a moment a quick diagram around that. Now, temperature also affects the rate of all chemical reactions, and this is shown in the communities found in alpine communities. In extremely hot ecosystems, animals tend to seek shade in the heat of the day to remain cool. In these alpine communities, so alpine meaning that it's cold and mountainous sort of region, so where we get lots of snow. Think of our snow communities in Australia, Mount Buller and Mount Kosciuszko, but also overseas in the really famous sort of snowfields in Europe and the US. These creatures have really important adaptations to either keep warm, so we think of mammals and they have very thick fur to insulate themselves, or we think of other animals like birds which just remain extraordinarily active, or perhaps during the worst parts of the day where there is likely to be lots of storms, they go and they hibernate somewhere, they sleep through those terrible storms or those snowstorms. So onto the screen now. We've got our desert community, so we're looking at the central of Australia. As we move further towards in your case it'll be the right, we have our grassland moving towards forests, and then we progress down into the coast. Now this is obviously a generalization, this isn't consistent, this isn't perfectly consistent, but it does give us a good example of what's happening. So here we have limited water, very intense sunlight and temperatures, soil is low in organic molecules, that's our desert. And what does that drive? Well, it drives plant producers that are going to have adaptations to survive that low quality of soil, to survive the very high temperatures with lots of sunlight and with very limited water. So we end up with very small bushes and shrubs and grasses that are going to be able to live through those conditions. And obviously, the consumers are going to be affected by which producers are present. Where we look now at our grassland moving to forests, there is more ready access to water. They have a little bit more rain. Perhaps there's even a river or a pond or a lake that runs through these areas. Still intense sunlight and temperatures. It's still Australia. It's still a hot continent. And then the soil has organic molecules. Now, that's because the producers that are present and the consumers that are present, there is enough of a population where when they die, the decomposers and detritivores break their bodies down, and that develops a soil, a rich or more rich soil. It's still Australia, so it's not perfect. And so what I've done is I've tried to indicate the amount of organic material just with this green line here. As we get further towards the coast, as we're increasing the amount of rainfall, we're having a bigger impact here where we're getting thicker and thicker soil. So we're getting a higher and higher quality soil here. As we get towards the coast, you'll see that it drops away. Now, if you've ever been to the beach, you'll have realized that the coast is quite wet. So why then is there this drop-off in organic material? Well, let's look. The water that it gets access to is often very salty. That means that the plants that live there have to be able to adapt to that. Now, that's quite hard to do. It's an energy-intensive process to survive in an area where there is lots and lots of salt. So those plants are small. So we don't have these massive eucalypt trees and these huge communities of grasses and shrubs that we might have further in the coast. We've got these very small bushes and shrubs that you think of again, the saltbush that we might find out in the desert, but these small sort of dune plants that are going to be able to survive that. We have increased clouds, so therefore there's lower temperatures and sunlight, so we do have that advantage, but again, soil is relatively low in organic molecules. The soil is the sand. Now, when a soil has lots of organic material, it's black. You think of your backyards, that dark brown or black soil, that's got lots of organic material. The light sandy color of the beach indicates not very much dead material. The blackness means that there is lots of that dead material, that dead organic material. So we have all of these adaptations, all of these changes that impact our relationship or the plant's producer's relationship and therefore the community's relationship with the land. And it's driven by what resources are present, biotic or abiotic. We were focusing deliberately on abiotic there. Again, as a reminder to you, we have an increasing amount or changes, to these abiotic factors, and that's what drives the change to the communities present. It's a really critical thing to keep in mind. Because these plants or these producers are the producers for most ecosystems, it's their ability to obtain nutrients that's key for the community. Without producers, there isn't going to be many consumers, or there aren't going to be many consumers. So the adaptations that improve this, one of them includes a symbiotic relationship with bacteria. The strong winds in the coastal regions and alpine regions, so the mountainous sort of regions, they make survival for plants difficult. So they need deeper root systems, or they might need to be able to grow into rocks, or rocky soil where they're going to be able to penetrate in and make a really good anchor hold there. Coastal communities, very high salt, which we already talked about. Waves, similar impact on plants to wind, destabilizes plants from their foundations. Many organisms have these adaptations to actually anchor themselves onto these rocky platforms that might exist under the soil. So many adaptations, purely driven at survival. In fact, that's what an adaptation is, remember? Adaptation is something that increases the likelihood for a species to survive at any particular environmental factor. Now, the key is, remember with adaptations, they're only advantageous in certain circumstances. So if, for example, it would be beneficial for a plant to actually release from its anchor point, to release from its foundation and travel somewhere else, if it's got an adaptation that it anchors itself into this platform or into the foundation, then that's lost an advantage, or it's not advantageous, and that population may die out. So you always need to be keeping in mind that this relationship between advantageous adaptations and the conditions that they're in is critical. So whenever you're thinking about what are some examples of advantageous adaptations, you need to make sure you're considering what is actually happening. You can't make a generic statement here because you will get it wrong. So make sure when you're considering this that that's to the forefront of your mind. Now what we're looking, just finishing off here, stratification. So some ecosystems develop in layers, and the easiest example of this by far are forest ecosystems. And they're divided into the following 4 strata: forest floor, shrubs, small trees, and then the large trees or the canopy. Now, each of these different strata has a different biotic or different resources available. So if we look at the forest floor, let's use the example that I had before. 10% of light gets to the forest floor. So this means the adaptations that need to be present there. Very large leaves, low lying close to the ground probably, so that they minimize the amount of energy they need to spend pumping water up to keep themselves upright, these plants. So they're going to be low lying. The animals that are going to be there, well, they'll probably be quite small so that they can avoid predators, so that they can also take advantage of the limited amount of energy that's going to be available there, because sunlight gets converted into energy. If there's only 10% of sunlight down there, then there's not going to be a lot of energy on that forest floor. So we're going to have small consumers there. When we get into the shrubs, so perhaps there's a spot where there's a little bit more light, so you're going to have small shrubs or medium-sized shrubs, and then we're going to have slightly larger animals. Maybe we'll have a few birds, maybe a few creatures like some squirrels in other countries, or for us it might be animals like a quoll or a quokka or some sort of carnivore perhaps there, so that it takes advantage of the birds. And we get to smaller trees. Again, we're looking at these adaptations that are going to be advantageous there. So they're probably going to have slightly larger leaves than those right up in the top canopy, so that they can take advantage of the little amount of sunlight that does get down there. The large trees or the canopy is really where we're going to have, in Australia at least, very narrow leaves because of the intensity of our sunlight. We're also going to find our larger sort of organisms there, or perhaps if they're not larger, they'll certainly be more numerous. So these are the kinds of things we need to consider. Again, we've gotten to some key terms, page 377. Chapter 4.4 review questions. This time though, it's not all questions, so take note of that. Questions 1 to 5, 7, and 9 to 12 are all you need to do for 4.4. Where we're looking now at another discussion. So the end video questions here is that stratification reduces interactions, and you need to follow the instructions when you get to that discussion. Again, as we finish year 11s, please remember emailing questions, asking questions in class, keeping up to date with those textbook questions so that you're actually keeping up to date, making sure that you understand, following through with anything you don't, so that I can actually work with you and help you in this. All right, that brings us to the end of our video here.